Good morning and welcome everyone to the third webinar in our member briefing series. This webinar is on understanding the new portable long service leave scheme. Member briefings are designed for our members to connect and stay informed on the latest sector news and developments. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the land of what was the Wangal people and now falls under the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and future, for they hold the memories, the culture and dreams of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I respect and recognise their cultural heritage, beliefs and continued relationship with the land. I acknowledge that the Uluru Statement of the Heart humbly remains an open invitation to support closing the gap. I also recognise those with lived and living experience of mental health challenges, their advocates and allies. Your experiences continue to inform the work we do. I also extend my empathy and understanding to those who remain private and silent about their mental health challenges and/or experiences. I have a few housekeeping things to get through, so bear with me. We will be recording the session and a link to the recording plus the slides will be sent out to all registrants and be available on our website in the next few days. We encourage you to keep your cameras on, but if you're not comfortable with being recorded, please feel free to switch it off. Please ensure you are mute until the audience Q&A portion of the meeting and start preparing your Q&A. Finally, along with the recording, we will also include a survey on the webinar. We welcome your feedback, suggestions and comments to help improve this new webinar series exclusive to our members. So as you all know, on the 20th of June 2024, the New South Wales Parliament passed legislation that established a new portable long service leave scheme for the community services sector, with the scheme coming into effect on the 1st of July this year. Mental Health Coordinating Council has engaged the Long Service Corporation, who are administering the scheme, to provide more information for our members and to ask their questions to support them through the implementation process. MHCC has actively been engaged in the advocacy around this, particularly in relation to the levy and the impact that that's going to have on services with no increased funding. So I'm calling out the elephant in the room first up. A reminder to keep your questions until after the presentation if you wish to ask them, or you can drop them in the chat box and we'll be answering them once we reach the Q&A section. It's now my delight to welcome Michaela Beale. Michaela joined the Long Service Corporation to lead the stakeholder engagement for the new Community Services Portable Leave Scheme. Prior to this, Michaela spent 19 years with New South Wales Fair Trading, with much of her work in the consumer-directed care space, working to help educate consumers about exercising their rights under their NDIS plans or home care packages. Michaela, welcome, and I will now hand over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Evelini. And I'd also like to acknowledge traditional custodians. I'm dialing in from Goombanga country, which is up on the mid-north coast, and acknowledge the elders of the country that I'm on and the elders of all of the countries that people are dialing in from today. So thank you for the opportunity to come along and have a talk about the new scheme. The Long Service Corporation has two existing portable long service schemes. One is in the building and construction space and the other one is in the contract cleaning space. But this new scheme for the community services sector is a very exciting project for us and hopefully part of more industries that will be able to come on to portable long service as we move forward. Next slide, Nim. So most of you would be familiar with traditional long service leave. You work for an employer for 10 years and then you get a period of paid leave. Now that we know that in the community services space, there's not always that opportunity to get to that 10-year tenure. There's changes in funding, there's changes to programs, changes to organisations that don't always make that 10-year point possible. So the government is bringing in the new portable scheme. So what the portable part means is that it rewards workers' service to the industry rather than just service to one individual employer. A few different things that come in with this scheme is that workers will be eligible to claim leave after only 7 years of service, or if they are what we consider to be a foundation worker, so somebody that is working in the industry within the first 6 months, so from 1 July through to 31st of December this year, those people will receive what we call our foundation worker bonus. Now that's an additional 365 days of service credits that are provided by the Long Service Corporation to recognise, those workers who are foundation members of the scheme. Now, the scheme is to be supported by a levy paid quarterly by eligible employers. The regulation for the scheme has actually just been finalised on Friday, so first people out with the new information. The levy rate has been set at 1.7% of gross ordinary wages. And I hear your point there, Evelini, about the elephant in the room, the financial implications of this scheme. The intention of the scheme is that it does provide for future growth in the community services space. It's with all of the challenges that people are facing, it's definitely a growth area. People are needing support. And the intention is that this scheme will recognise, the service and experience and skills that those workers bring and provide them an incentive to be there for that future growth. But there is that implication and the challenges of that levy rate. It is the employer that needs to pay the levy rate on behalf of their workers. Now, they should. Most employers are putting aside an allocation for future long service claims, but I do understand that this was work in a very different way for a lot of organisations. There is continuing to be lobbying by New South Wales Council of Social Service, Mental Health Coordinating Council, National Disability Services. A number of organisations are raising that issue that, while the intention is that this will provide for future growth, that there is that short-term impact, and the last thing we actually want to see is this impacting service delivery. So, that lobbying continues. Just on the financial side as well, I can clarify to your members that the levies don't just disappear into the bigger government coffers. This is a purpose fund, a purpose-built fund. It needs to be invested in certain ways. And the intention is that the equity within the fund grows over time, that it stays within the fund and the fund builds its own equity. Now, the contract cleaning scheme that we have, it actually has recently just had its levy rate reduced. So, while normally rates from government do tend to go up over time, there has actually been precedent with this one of the rate coming down as the equity is built up within the fund. So I'm hopeful that will be something that happens for this one as well. Next slide, Nim. So the community services space. There's 31 different types of community services work that are captured within the scope of this scheme. So it's a very broad sector, all different sorts of services and supports, as you can see on the screen there. There's two that are out of scope that it would be considered normally community services, but are out of scope for this scheme. So one of them is early childhood education, preschools and things like that are not included, and aged care is not included. But I just want to clarify that is residential aged care is out of scope. Our category there of community care services does cover the in-home supports that can be provided to both people with disability, older, senior Australians, the supports that are provided for people to stay living independently in their own home, and that category is regardless of the age of the client. So there are a lot of services that do mix across the disability space and the aged care space, and that category, our description there of community care, will hopefully help people, understand where they fit under the scope of the scheme. Next slide, Nim. Now, there's a couple of different types of eligibility. The first one is where the worker themselves performs work under one of those 31 different types of community services work. If that worker is doing work that's captured within the scope of the scheme, then that worker needs to be registered with the scheme, regardless of whether that is the purpose of the organisation that they work for. Now, an example that I've come across with this is some universities will employ financial counsellors to help students manage their HECS debts and that sort of thing. Financial counselling is work that's included within the scope, so people who are doing that work do need to be registered with the scheme, regardless of if that's the purpose of their organisation. Now, I'm wondering if this also might be relevant in the mental health space. I know that it's increasing that people are aware of mental health needs of their staff and their workers. So it might be something to consider moving forward if somebody is providing the sort of mental health supports and services for people, they would still be need to include it in the scheme. Now, the bigger picture is where the employer themselves identifies as a community service provider. So where the predominant purpose of that organisation is to deliver community services work. Now, in that situation, all employees, all workers that are paid by that organisation will need to be registered with the scheme. So that's paid executive, paid administrative and support staff, paid frontline workers, anyone who is paid, full-time, part-time or casuals, will all need to be registered with the scheme. Now, a couple of outs for the self-employed contractors. If somebody is working for themselves and they are a sole trader, then it's up to them whether they want to opt into the scheme or not. They could use the scheme as a way of budgeting and preparing for their own paid leave in the future, but it's not mandatory for self-employed contractors. It is, however, mandatory for those eligible workers and for the workers in an eligible organisation. Now, out of scope are people who are working and paid by either federal, state or local government, where a business is a partnership and the partners in that business are outside of the scope of this Act, and similarly where the organisation is a corporation, the directors are outside of the scope of this Act as well. So it's really about the workers, people who are paid by that organisation for the work they do. Next slide, Nim. So that predominant purpose, what is the predominant purpose of the organisation? And that's quite a big question that we're still working through to provide guidelines on to support industry on how to assess that. It will be a self-assessment process by organisations, so they will need to review what their business picture is and then make that determination as to whether their predominant purpose is community services work and therefore register all of their employees, or whether it's just some of their employees that need to be registered. Now, as I said, there are resources that are being developed for this, and it will be a multi-factor test. So the biggest weight will be given to things like the core activities of that organisation and how they allocate the resources to deliver the services that they do. But there'll be the bigger picture to be considered as well. What is the mission or purpose of that organisation? What does their constitution say? Are they registered with the ACNC, and is there those kind of indicators as to what the purpose of the organisation is? Strategic objectives, key performance indicators, all of those bigger picture situations will need to be taken into account by an organisation before they make that determination of their predominant purpose. So we have got descriptions. We're preparing descriptions of those 31 categories of work, which will help employers determine, where their workers sit within that bigger picture of predominant purpose. So more information will be coming for that, and we'll certainly keep, this group informed as that when those resources are out. Next one, Nim. Now, one that comes up a lot is transitional arrangements. Where do we stand with any entitlements that we already have as a worker versus what comes in with the new scheme? Now, I'm part Italian, so excuse the hands here, but the 1 July is very much the line in the sand on this for this new scheme. So it doesn't replace any existing entitlements under the 1955 Long Service Leave Act, or any entitlements that a worker might have under an enterprise agreement. It will be a case of which one comes up first for that worker as to which of those instruments that worker will claim their long service leave under. So employers will keep that responsibility for any entitlements that worker has accrued up to that 1 July point. From 1 July, those provisions need to be then paid for into the fund through that levy paid into the fund. Now, if a worker, I'll give an example here of a worker who's perhaps been with their organisation already for 8 years. So they will become eligible for their long service leave under the 1955 Act in 2 years' time. They'll have reached that 10-year point. In that situation, the employer will need to pay out the long service payment for that worker. They need to cover the 8 years portion themselves, and they notify the Long Service Corporation and seek reimbursement of the 2-year portion that sits with the fund. So there is a sharing of those responsibilities. It's calculated on pre-scheme and post-scheme entitlements. Up until the scheme sort of reaches its own maturity, there'll be that need for the employer to cover those entitlements and then seek reimbursement from the long service fund for the portion from 1 July onwards. Sorry about the hands. I hope that's all clear and making sense. Similarly, if somebody's on an enterprise agreement that says they can claim long service leave after 5 years, if they've already been 3 years with their organisation and in 2 years' time they want to take their leave, the employer needs to pay for the full leave. The employer covers the 3-year portion pre the scheme themselves, notifies the corporation and seeks reimbursement of the 2-year portion that would sit with the fund. So it really will come down to what is the person claiming their long service leave under, whether it's the 1955 Act, whether it's an enterprise agreement, or whether it purely sits with the scheme. Now, Nim, I'll get you to go on to the next one. Now, there's a couple of good provisions in here for workers that offering that flexibility. So the 31 different types of work that we covered in the beginning, people can move within those 31 different types and their service still remains to the industry. Their portable long service leave will come with them. Workers can also have a gap of up to 4 years break from the industry without losing the entitlements that are held with the fund. So, whether that be travel, other types of leave that they want to take, people can go up to 4 years without losing the balance that's held in the fund. Now, there can be additional time added to that 4-year time frame, what they call non-service days. So that would include things like community work, maternity leave, pregnancy, caregiving, illness or injury, and it also does cover for domestic or family violence situations, not only for the worker, but for serious issues that are affecting immediate family members as well. If those days need to be added to the worker's record, then the employer will need to let the corporation know to have that 4-year timeframe extended. Now, there's also provision where workers who have been with the scheme for 5 years, minimum of 5 years here, and then decide to leave the industry permanently. There's an option there where they can request a pro rata payout of their long service leave entitlement rather than having to take it as a period of paid leave. In the regulation that's just been released, those circumstances will also include things like illness or injury. If somebody becomes deceased, their estate can make a claim on that entitlement. And there is also provision there for financial hardship as well, if somebody's leaving the industry and is experiencing financial hardship. Now, the next slide. So where we're up to, as Evelini mentioned, it's coming in as of 1 July, and our education piece at this stage is very much around supporting employers to determine that predominant purpose. As part of the online registration that will need to happen from 1 July, employers will need to complete a declaration regarding their predominant purpose, having assessed those core activities, the purpose, the function of their workers, all of those sort of factors, and then make that declaration. They are either identify as a community service provider and all their workers are in, or they only need to register the eligible workers. Now, from 1 July, employers will also need to be tracking the service of their workers. So the returns for this program are done quarterly. However, I will note at this point that there will be a delay in the first levy payments or first payments to be made. So while the scheme is a quarterly system and a quarterly process, the first lot of levy payments won't need to be made until after April 2026. So in 2026, the organisation will need to submit 3 quarters of returns. Anyone who's included in those first 2 returns that cover the first 2 quarters of the remainder of this year will be automatically registered as foundation workers and receive that 365 days bonus credits there as well. The things that we need people to be tracking are, the dates that the workers worked with them. So we're not actually tracking hours or, which days of the week that a worker is working. It's a quarterly return, and it might be that worker has been employed for the full quarter. We'll need to track what the gross ordinary wages are that have been paid to each worker. So that doesn't include any other sort of entitlements or loadings or any, additional amounts that might come to that worker. It's their gross ordinary wages. And in terms of identifying workers, we need to have their date of birth, an email address, and a phone number for their records. Now, it might come up that people might be working for more than one employer. Sometimes people can be 2 days here, 2 days there. There's a lot of flexibility these days. Each employer will need to submit a return for that worker. So, as I said, we're not tracking hours necessarily. It's just the gross ordinary wages that have been paid to that worker by that employer. So that worker might end up with 2 or 3 returns coming in for that person, but it all gets added onto their records. I'll go to the last slide now. So, in the lead up to the scheme, there's a lot of information that's going up onto our website more all the time. We're aware of the need of employers to need this information and to be able to make that determination about their predominant purpose with confidence. So in addition to the website, we are working on those guidelines and the category descriptions to help employers make that determination. We're also providing a template for tracking the workers' service so that can come in from 1 July and people will, have their service recorded. Now, as we get closer to the scheme coming in, we'll also be offering online and face-to-face training about how to use the portal that's coming in. So from 1 July, there'll be an employer registration portion, but there is further work being done on having a full employer portal where employers can go in and manage their returns themselves. There'll also be a worker portal where workers can go in and check what their balance is and make sure that they, what's being recorded for them is correct and that they have been registered if they should be. So there's a couple of links on the side there to our Long Service Corporation website. We're putting out regular newsletters to help industry keep up to date and informed with the progress as the scheme comes in. Our first newsletter went out last week and we're expecting that the next one will go out by the beginning of May, and it will have those resources about determining predominant purpose and the steps that employers will need to take before the scheme comes in. We've got an email address at the bottom there, which is through to our engagement team. So we'll be managing the inquiries that come in. There's also a call centre line there for phone inquiries where people can get support directly from our call centre staff as well. So probably happy to open it out to any questions now.
Thank you, Michaela. We have got one question, but I've also just acknowledging that we've also got, I want to thank you, Michaela. It's a lot of detail, and I know you and the team have done a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes to get ready for the scheme start. So thank you for getting around the country to actually make sure that people are informed about it all. I just want to take this opportunity. Please do put your questions in the chat or when we're ready to launch into questions, and we can put your hand up and have a direct question answered. But I want to take this opportunity to introduce Michaela's colleague, Jess Eggins, who's the Project Officer and Stakeholder Engagement Long Service Corporation with the Department of Customer Service, who will assist Michaela in answering the questions. Jess has over 8 years of experience in New South Wales state government engagement roles. She's worked across Safe Work New South Wales, healthcare and social assistance space, and in New South Wales fair trading, where she launched and led the Disability Community Voice Network. I'm also going to introduce my colleague in MHCC, who's our wonderful finance manager, Rosalind Bowes, to kick off with some questions. So over to you, Ros.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't have a video on, but I do have a couple of questions for Michaela and Jess. You talked about the transitional arrangements, but can I give another example of, say, of someone who has been working for an organisation, say, for 5 years, and so under the current scheme, of course, they'd have to work another 10 to get long service leave. However, given the new scheme, does that mean they just, after two more years now, they can actually apply for long service leave? Because that would be 7 years.
No, if they've been employed for 5 years already, then their first option to claim would be under the 1955 Act. which is when they've had 10 years of service to their employer. So if they've already had 5 years of service, they will need to go another 5 years to be able to claim under the 1955 Act. Now,
Sorry, Michaela. So does that sort of mean that anyone who is currently employed under the old Act really follows that through to the end?
It follows it either through or whichever one comes up first for them. So in that situation, you know, that 5 year point, so 5 years pre-scheme, 5 years post-scheme will bring them to the 10-year mark. And for that worker, that's going to be their first option to be able to claim their long service leave. For somebody who'd already been, say, with an employer for 2 years, they then would need to go another 8 years before they could claim under the 1955 Act. But that entitlement under the new scheme will come in at either 7 years if they're not a foundation worker, or at the 6-year point when they are a foundation worker. So I know it's a little bit confusing, and my hands are going everywhere trying to explain this, but
okay, no, I understand. Yeah, no, yes. That's clear. Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
I have one more, and then I'll pass it back to Evelina, and I'm sure she's got some other questions. In the Act, I think it's section 52A, it talks about having 1,825 days of recognised service to get a pro rata payment instead of long service leave. So again, I guess from what you've just said, it doesn't mean that someone who has more than 10 years now can automatically get that payout once it rolls over into the new scheme. Is that right?
No, they'd need to be 5 years under the provisions of the new scheme.
New scheme, right.
Yes, so
right.
A lot of it will come down to which Act are you calling upon.
Yes.
If you're calling upon the 1955, the provisions of that Act apply. If you're calling upon things within the new Act, it will only apply from 1 July and the provisions that are in place from there. So that number of days you mentioned, that works out to be that 5-year mark.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'll let someone else have a turn.
Thank you so much, Ros. Feel free to put your hands up, but otherwise I'm going to go to the questions in the chat, and they're coming in thick and fast, Michaela and Jess, so forgive me. And I know that some people are using captions, so if you do put your hand up and ask a question, please speak slowly, which is my demise. It is my Achilles heel. I speak 100 miles a minute and work at 100 miles a minute, so I will try and ask the questions slowly and calmly. For the foundational members, that additional year of service credit, does this remain solely with the PLSL authority if the employer pays out existing employee long service leave entitlement upon termination? Michaela or Jess?
I'll take that one. So regarding that foundation workers bonus, that is accessible when workers mature in the new portable scheme, and workers can actually make that claim. It will be either that 6-year mark if they're that foundational bonus, or 7 years. If there is that overlap with the 1955 Act, that foundation workers bonus sits there just waiting to be claimed the next time.
So again, it would depend on which Act is being called upon to provide for the leave. There's no provision under the 1955 Act for that bonus to be paid out, only under the new Act for that bonus to be paid out. So if somebody makes a claim and they're claiming under the 1955 Act, they may not empty their bank in some ways with the Long Service Corporation. They may, in a couple of years' time decide to take a period of paid leave, and it's shared between the 1955 and the new Act, but it mightn't clear out their balance. They might just say, all right, I'm going to take this portion now and keep some in there for later. Once they've reached the 6-year or 7-year mark, depending on if they're a foundation worker, that bonus can only be paid directly to the worker. It can't be used as part of that reimbursement to the employer. So they may need to then have another portion of leave to be able to claim that bonus.
Rebecca, I might just get you to give me a thumbs up if that answers your question. Otherwise, feel free to come off mute and ask a clarifying question should you wish to. Okay, I've got a thumbs up. And then Paul has asked, it is given a thumbs up on that, but are workers engaged in early childhood education and employed by an eligible employer to be registered, Michaela or Jess?
Yeah, yes.
I thought
So
that was
that
important.
predominant purpose rule would apply. So even if it's, they're not doing traditional community services work, similarly with admin, HR, payroll staff, that sort of thing, it's not actually captured under the 31 types, but they're working for an organisation, and everyone in that organisation is considered to be contributing to community services work.
And Michaela, that's whether they're under a award, non-award, or enterprise bargaining?
That's right. This Act doesn't necessarily specify on awards. It's purely that predominant purpose test. I know that in some other states they, use the SHADS award and other awards to determine eligibility. That wasn't taken as the option for New South Wales. It was considered that a broader scope would be given, and the scheme would be open to more people that way.
Thanks, Michaela. Dev, you've got your hand up. I'm sorry if I'm Devlin or Dev. I'm not sure. You're welcome to ask a question.
Or you is fine. Look, there's a lot in here. So one, how are redundancies meant to be factored in? Bearing in mind in a lot of scenarios, if an employee, say, gets to 5 years, you need to contribute as part of any ETP towards that. The other one is with those concepts of having a break. What happens where the person has a break and then leaves from one organisation to another? When is the expectation that we, an organisation, would then cancel out that provision for long service leave? So, e.g., Dev, 30 June, is with an employer, goes on a break for a year, works for another 6 months, and then resigns from the current role and goes to another organisation, but still within that sector. How long do we have to keep these provisions going? And also, as a sub question to that is, when our provisions are calculated, they are based upon our expected length of service. All of us are now going to be carrying a much higher liability at 30th of June, which, as we mentioned, is completely unfunded at the moment. So sorry, 3 tiers to that. Sorry, I've just dropped a hell of a lot on you both, but
Look, I'll go for the one in terms of what happens to any entitlement. So the employer does need to, budget and retain funds to cover any existing entitlement. If a worker then leaves that organisation and they haven't met either the requirements of the 1955 Act or the requirements to claim under the new scheme, the employer doesn't have any more obligations. Those obligations haven't needed to be met. However, you have had to pay into the scheme on behalf of that worker, and the new scheme keeps those funds. So they're not reimbursed to you once that worker goes on. That stays as part of that worker's record. And if that worker then starts with a new organisation, they come with that balance in the fund already for them.
But what about the predating? Aren't you through that saying, so on the bright side, you've said there's no cross-claim from, say, community service organisation A to community service organisation B, but that then means that the fund's going to have a shortfall.
The funds so if the worker leaves and they haven't met any obligation, then the employer doesn't need to keep any more provision for that worker. But from 1 July, they contribute to the scheme. So the scheme holds those funds. Sorry, you might need to explain your question a little bit more.
So just say I've been here for 3 years.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So there's an obligation. If I then went through to year 10, I would put in a claim, and my organisation would put a claim on the fund for 7 years.
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, at 30th of June, I have still been here for 3 years. I start to pay into the fund. I pay into the fund for 2 years. So, there's that 2-year concept.
Yep.
I then moved from my organisation to another organisation and worked for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
So because I've already left my organisation, that first 3 years effectively is unfunded.
Yes, the organisation doesn't need to pay because that worker didn't meet any of the criteria under the Act.
Okay.
However, the 2 years post the fund stays in the fund
Yeah.
against that worker's record.
Okay.
You leave employer, go to a new one, the new employer starts paying in and your balance moves with you as part of the concept of portable.
Yeah, but in that particular case, there's no obligation on myself as the organisation to either, one, fund another community organisation for that first 3 years, or two, pay to the funding levy itself that first 3 years.
No, the first 3
Okay.
years purely sits with the employer and under that 1955 Act. If the worker doesn't meet the payout criteria, then yes, that is lost. As it probably always is up until this new portable scheme comes in. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. That's very clear.
Okay. Thanks, Dev. I know you've got a 3-tiered question, so we
yeah.
might have to have them answered very quickly because we've got quite a few questions
look,
now and about
to
22
be
minutes
honest,
left.
in reality, I think that also answers one of the other tranches. The only one I think it would be useful for everybody on the call to understand is that concept of eligible terminations if someone is ever made redundant, because you might need to pay out a portion of that long service leave under that ETP.
And that's not one I can answer, but it's one I've jotted down here as one we need to do a bit more research on. So thanks, Devlin.
Fair enough.
Thank you, Dev. Thanks, Michaela and Jess. Michaela, sorry. So we have a question here from Rhonda. As an employer, will we have any liability for someone who has worked for, say, 2 years, left February 2025, and signs up to the new scheme if they have stayed in the sector? Because I think that starts to hit the couple of quarters that we're going to need to report in April. Does that make sense?
Yes. So if they left in February 2025, they've left before the scheme came into effect. Anything that was accrued under that, if they haven't met the 10-year, then that has gone. That's
because the scheme comes into effect from the 1st of July, but your first reporting period is in April, backtracking to the first 2 quarters. So hopefully that answers your question, Rhonda. Megan, are you also developing resources that employers can share with staff to help communicate these changes? This is part of the reason we're doing this webinar, because it's very complex, and unless you are a bit of a HR, ER specialist, it's quite challenging to navigate. But Michaela, did you want to mention those resources? That
it is, and look, it's really important as part of this scheme that workers, that while our initial messaging is very much to employers, that first action is for them to do the predominant purpose, register for what's required. It's really important that workers are aware of this as well. Workers will be the people that will, that they've got the incentive of the foundation worker bonus to make sure that they are in and registered on time. They'll also be the ones that, if they're not registered as they should be, or if their returns aren't as they should be, there'll be the options for workers to come back to the corporation and, for those issues to be worked through. More information will come for workers, particularly in, we're looking at a number of different formats for that, a number of different languages for that. And, we're trying to be out to as many industry events for both employers and workers as we can.
Thank you. And I've got just another question for Megan, which is interesting. If an employee leaves the industry but is not qualified for long service leave, does the corporation repay the levies back to the employers?
No, they don't. Once under the Act, the employer has that obligation. If the worker leaves the industry, they can do that and without losing anything that's held on their record for up to that 4 years, as I mentioned. If they don't come back after the 4 years, then that money does stay with the fund. There's been no provision for it to be paid out. So
thanks, Michaela. And I think that the couple of questions are all about when someone enters a scheme and there's still confusion or about what the entitlements are. So here's one from Lisa. If someone has been with an employer for 8 years and is already entitled to long service leave under their EBA, would they be able to take that? And then if they change companies, would they be able to take that with them if they change companies? If not, how long would they need to wait?
Okay, so the portable element doesn't come in until this Act comes in. So even if you're on an enterprise agreement and you've been with that employer for 8 years, if you have an entitlement under that enterprise agreement, it doesn't move on with you if you move on to another employer. So in that situation, you may be better off, ensuring you get what you're entitled to under a current employer. Because there's no portable element of the scheme until 1 July.
So let me play that out a bit further. 1st of July comes along. I've been there for 8 years. I can go bank my 8 years with the corporation, and then it might be portable. So
no.
It's after the 1st of July. No. Okay.
No. The 8 years stays, the obligation for that stays with the existing employer.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
It only becomes portable from 1 July.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's only the contributions made from 1 July that become portable. So if there's 8 years entitlement already with that employer, that will stay with that employer. If the person leaves, as Devla mentioned, there may need to be some sort of perhaps a payout. I'm not right across that side of it, but if they leave, even after the scheme comes in, it's only the portion from 1 July that will retain with the long service fund. Any entitlement before that becomes a negotiation between the worker and that employer. It's under a different act.
Okay. I got one here from David. If I worked 3 years in one community organisation and changed to another employer in the sector and currently worked 4 years, does this make me eligible? It's the same types of questions, but
same, yeah. And again, that 1 July is very much the line in the sand. Anything that happens prior to 1 July becomes an entitlement with your existing employer under either the 1955 Act or an enterprise agreement, but it's not included into the provisions of the scheme.
I think what's confusing everyone, including myself, or maybe it's only confusing me, maybe everyone else is across this, is that you're paying into the scheme back from April, but backdated to the 1st of July. So come February or come April, you're backdating whatever banked people have got banked. I think people are so if you retire, resign, finish up prior to the 1st of July, you get what you get. But if it's in the scheme from the 1st of July, you just don't need to report till April. So have I got that right, Michaela?
Yes, you don't need to pay until April, yes. But look, people may become eligible before April. And that's something that, while the levy amounts won't come in until April, the fund does start with, a beginning operating balance.
There's a transition period where there's some work to be navigated.
There is, yes.
Glad it's you and not me, Michaela. All right, we've got A.T. Thompson. I haven't got any hands live, so I'm going to just keep going with the questions in the chat. Can someone please send a link to the regulation that has handed down on the 11th of April 2025, which confirmed the 1.7% levy? Either someone in my team or Jess and Michaela can do that in the chat. Thank you.
Yes, will do.
Kathy, our workforce is predominantly casual, including weekends. There's quite a few questions about casual. Previously, calculation was based on hours worked, with it to be higher of 1 or 5 years. How does this work in the future?
Look, as I mentioned, we don't necessarily, track hours of the worker. It will be during that quarter, what was that worker paid? What was their gross ordinary wages during that time? Regardless of whether they were full-time, part-time or casual, some people will come in with a full 5-day salary for each week of the quarter. Some people might just come in with a 1 day or whatever they were paid for the weekend work. If that's their gross ordinary wages, that's what the levy rate is based on. So
there is a follow-up question that's very linked to what we're talking about now from Carla. What is included in gross ordinary wages for the 1.7% levy? Are shift penalties, loadings included, for example? I'm thinking yes.
I'm thinking no, but look,
No.
that's something that we
Don't rely on me for HR advice. Yes.
yeah. And look, that's, the gross ordinary part, and perhaps Ros maybe might be able to help with this one as well. Gross
Ros
ordinary
Bowes, what do
wages.
you think?
Yes, I would say no. So yeah, the gross ordinary is really just your basic wage that would be in your letter of offer, not so much penalties and things on top of it.
Perfect. I'll take 2 as the going rate. That wins this one. I can't find any transitional provisions in the legislation. Transitional provisions in the relevant act. Are there provisions in the relevant act?
There is, and look, we can send through the sections that applies to. It talks about recognising other, instruments, including the 1955 Act or an enterprise agreement. And it will be a similar thing if there is entitlements in another state as well. It is about the scheme recognising that there may be, a worker may have other entitlements. And there's provisions about no double dipping, I suppose. You can't claim on Queensland and New South Wales, or you can't claim on the 1955 and the new Act. But it's about making sure that the records reflect what leave has been taken. So where there is that sharing, we'll pop the link to the section. I haven't got it on the top of my brain, but there definitely is a section that refers to those other acts that need to be taken into account.
Thank you. And we can always provide any additional information in a follow-up to the webinar. I've got a question that's come directly to me. Bearing in mind that CMOs, NGOs may have workers living with disabilities, what accommodation will the corporation make regarding an employer's obligation to check online profiles and any other requirements when they may experience difficulties?
So is that question more related to how we will work with those people if they're experiencing difficulties in addressing the scheme, or accessing the scheme and understanding the obligations?
Yeah, and I think just online profiles and keeping, there's an obligation on the employers just as much as there is on the employer. So it is overly complicated, just the accessibility and support that might be available for employees.
Yeah, look, certainly, our call centre staff and our engagement team, probably our engagement team, we would like to think we're reasonably diverse, and culturally competent. Our call centre staff, would have sort of an introductory level of diversity training. But if there is that requirement, that need for people to be getting additional support, we will put a warm referral or a sort of a transfer or an escalation process in place to make sure that if a worker is struggling with that call centre level information, that we can take a deeper dive into what might be required there and get any sort of help or support that we can to make sure that worker gets what they need. There's a lot of, you've mentioned lived experience, it's really important in a lot of spaces. The value of that lived experience is fantastic for the support and service that's provided to clients. But there can mean some barriers with some government systems. Government systems aren't known for their accessibility. But in understanding the community that we're working with here, we'll certainly be encouraging, a lot of that diversity training for the staff, but also to sort of recognise if you're not getting where you need to, please come to us for any additional help and support.
Thanks, Michaela.
I'll just add my 2 cents on that one, because accessibility is really important to me as someone with the lived experience. In the way that we want to connect with industry and help support industry, we're looking to build resources that we hear from industry would be of value, things that would be of benefit, and we've been quite open and share our contact email address of that community services at long service. Any questions, queries, please don't hesitate to reach out. If there is a resource that we think would be of value, or if industry thinks would be of value to help build that accessibility, we'd like to hear from it. And we don't know what we don't know. We certainly come with broad range of accessibility. It's one of the great things in bringing Michaela and myself into this team, is that it is front and foremost, and we've been heard on that in building those resources to make sure that people that work within the space can receive this in a way that they can use.
Thank you so much, Jess. And we really appreciate the work that's happening to try and make it inclusive and accessible. Judy is our wonderful chair for MHCC. I hand over to Judy for your question or comment.
I think I've got this right. So if I can understand it, I'm an employer. I've got somebody that's worked for us for 8 years, and I retain that, let's call it superannuation. But from 1 July, I then contribute to the scheme. So when the worker wants to then access it, does the employer pay the 8 years? I'm just saying when they get up to the 10 years. And then the scheme, that the employee has to go then to the scheme, or does the employer pay the whole amount out and then ask for the scheme to reimburse that 2 years or whatever period it is?
Okay, so I'll just very quickly call on the superannuation. We don't want to get confused with superannuation.
Sorry, yes. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I did confuse it.
Yeah. The 8 years, the employer retains that responsibility.
Yes.
In 2 years' time, when the worker becomes eligible under the 1955, the employer needs to cover the full 10-year payment.
Okay.
They need to notify the corporation so that those 2 years' worth of records can be basically removed from that person's account, and the money for that goes back to reimburse the employer.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks.
So there is that importance that we get notified. So that the records are kept, clean. The person took that 2-year portion as part of that. That's removed. They then continue on from there, when they come back from leave and waiting to accrue their next batch, I suppose.
Okay. Let me see. So we have a question here. So if I'm entitled to my long service leave now, will the amount that accrues as portable be eligible to be taken as long service leave, even if I move jobs in a year or two? Or would I need to wait for 7 to 10 years again to be eligible to take the long service leave? I think that's just talking about long service leave provisions rather than the scheme, but Michaela or Jess?
Look, I think what the person's entitled to now under their current employer stays with that current employer. Now, if they leave, before or even after the scheme comes in, that balance doesn't stay in their account. It's only anything that's in their account or their record with the Long Service Corporation from 1 July onwards. It's only from 1 July onwards that it becomes portable. So if they are eligible now, they can take that at a time that suits them, and then have that sharing of the obligation of the payment, as we just mentioned with Judy. Some will come from the employer, some comes reimbursed from the fund. But if they leave that employer and then start with a new employer, if they start with a new employer prior to 1 July this year, then they'll only have a very small amount of entitlement with that employer. So probably their quickest leave is going to come up through the 7 years or the 6 years of the new scheme. And it will only be from 1 July onwards that any balance that they have in account will be portable. So if they left that employer, say, in December this year, they've got 6 months worth with the fund. They start with their new employer next January, their new employer starts paying the levy on their behalf. They've still got that 6 months that was accrued from 1 July onwards. That stays with their account. Even though it came from a previous employer, it stays in that person's balance. So, at 6 years' time, because they're a foundation worker, they'll be then able to claim on a period of paid leave under the new scheme. I know it's lots of hand movements here.
And can I just add a little bit to, what I think is applicable under the EA I work under anyway, is that so that 8 years, for instance, if I leave the organisation, part of my termination package is the pro rata portion of the long service leave. So whilst I might not have the option to take the time, I won't lose the money per se, and then it kind of resets from there.
But yes, look, that's it. Whatever you're entitled to under the existing provisions, whether that's the 1955 Act or an enterprise agreement, this new Act doesn't replace those or, supersede them or anything like that. And that's why this whole transitional thing is pretty hard to explain, because those entitlements still exist. You've worked for that employer for that period of time. You have an entitlement with them. Now, it will come down to whether you're able to take that entitlement. Under the 1955 Act, you have to reach 10 years of service, whether that's pre or post scheme, you still need to reach 10 years. Under an enterprise agreement, it may be only 5 years. But anything less than those amounts, the other two acts don't apply. Anything from 1 July onwards, you can call upon the new act to apply. Work whichever one works best for you would be my advice. Whichever one gets you the best outcome there. You know, it is really about the outcomes for workers on this as well. You know, the schemes will need to, or the provisions will need to work hand in hand to some degree.
Thank you, Michaela. I am very conscious that we've got 3 minutes to go and I've got about 4 or 5 more questions. So I'm just going to ask one more question, maybe for a quick response. We have employees who are working in administration who have been in the organisation for over 10 years. Is it compulsory for these employees to convert to the Portable Long Service Leave Scheme if they do not wish to and are looking to retire in the next few years?
Look, those employees will have provisions either under their 1955 or enterprise agreement, but if the predominant purpose of the organisation is community services work, then it is compulsory for those workers to come onto the scheme. The only people that it's optional for are self-employed contractors.
Perfect. There are a myriad of other questions, but I think we're going to call it there. It is highly complex schemes. So we appreciate, Michaela, that you've left us with the contact email address, which we'll share for all the attendees today so that you can have a conversation with your relevant HR team and revert directly to the email if you wish to. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Michaela and Jess for sharing their expertise and for all of you for your active participation. The insights gained today will undoubtedly help us as we navigate the implications for the scheme that's starting in 2 months and a bit. We will be sending out the sector update following the event, which will include the recording, the PowerPoint slides, along with a short survey. If you could, please complete the survey, as we would love to know your thoughts on these webinars and potentially any other topics that you might like to see moving forward. We hope this session has been useful today. We look forward to seeing you at future MACC member exclusive events. Thanks for your time. Have a lovely day, and we'll catch you next time.